With the Dreamcast, Sega looked to step away from the pure arcade ports that characterised the Saturn in favour of the more feature-rich experiences that were on the rival PlayStation. Nowhere is this more evident than in SEGA GT, and in the absence of ports like Scud Race. So what is SEGA GT? Well, it's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It's Sega's own interpretation of Gran Turismo. My thoughts went wild as a teen. Could you imagine the depth and authenticity of Gran Turismo with the flair and addictive gameplay that Sega are renowned for? Surely it would result in the best racing game ever.
This is great! And all I've done is enter my name!
So, let's review. Graphically, I think it's fair to say that SEGA GT is good. I am struggling to make it sound better or worse than it is. The visuals are fine, decent, adequate, solid, and yes, generally good. It's clearly an upgrade over the PS1 games that inspired it. The visuals are clean and well defined. However, after games like Sega Rally 2, as uneven as that port was on the Dreamcast, and the Model 3 games in the arcades, SEGA GT really is lacking that visual flair that you'd expect from Sega. There's little in the way of style here. It all feels just functional, where even Gran Turismo itself had a lighting model that gave it identity. So Sega GT gets a passing grade, but we know the teams and the hardware itself can do better. It looks good, but we expected more, especially at 30 frames per second. Sound wise, it's a similar story. Engine and all other sound effects are just fine. There's nothing here that's going to blow your socks off. It does the job in this respect. The effects come off as authentic enough, especially for the time. There's nothing really special of note. No arcade sounds like Daytona USA's selection sounds, Sega Rally's countdown, Manx TT's passing a checkpoint. It's all very much, just like the visuals, functional. The music is great though, as you'd expect from a Sega title. There's a fantastic soundtrack that embodies that techno-rock fusion that was so common in the late 90s and early 2000s video games. There's some exceptional tracks here. Solid Circuit sounds like something from a boss battle or an arcade fighting game. Night Ground and Night Section A feel like the true arcade style tunes that you'd hear in games like Tokyo Highway Battle, Sega Touring Car and Ridge Racer. And Sky Peak Tour gives me real 1998 Sonic the Hedgehog vibes. My favourite though is Deep Rock Road, which starts with a fairly mellow tune and then slowly evolves into some sort of progressive rock with a 2000s twist, with an electronic organ sound that really gives me Pink Floyd vibes, sounding like the band's epic Dogs. In summary, the music is fantastic. So, in terms of gameplay then, structurally it follows the Gran Turismo template to the letter. You start by taking some driving tests, you buy a very cheap car with your starting credits, you race, you earn more credits to buy better cars, enter more races, pass more tests, until you have a collection of incredible racing machines to win absolutely every cup possible. It's a tried and true gameplay loop that endures today. But Sega GT doesn't quite stick the landing. From the start, the license tests themselves lack the imagination of their PlayStation inspiration. They're just glorified time trials with very strict time limits. That's the first sign that Sega GT isn't all it should be. The handling model itself feels floaty. The heavy, tactile driving gameplay of previous arcade classics is gone, which seems like a contradiction given that a sim racer should feel more grounded. Whereas Sega Rally on the Sega Saturn would give the player the feeling of different driving surfaces, this feeling is completely absent from Sega GT. That's not to say that the driving model is bad, it's just indistinct and lacking substance. It's enjoyable, but you can feel the conflict between the objective of building a sim racer and Sega's innate arcade sensibilities. And what you get is a game that achieves neither. The gameplay actually does feel good once you get used to it, but it does take a little while. There's some great ideas in here though. The car creation and customization options are outstanding and well ahead of their time, and I don't believe that they've actually been fully replicated elsewhere. When I first pumped dozens of hours into Sega GT, I plonked a Dodge Viper engine into a Mini Cooper shell to hilarious result. It's a great and unique addition to the genre, and I spent an inordinate amount of time creating oddball cars and running them through the game's drag races. So, Sega GT is a good game, but it's not a great one. The handling model sits oddly between the arcade and sim, and whilst eventually satisfying in itself, achieves the highs of neither approach. What should have been a vehicular celebration that harkened back to Sega's arcade classic roots feels like a game that is struggling for identity, shamelessly mimicking Gran Turismo that, whilst adding some novel new ideas, falls short in terms of execution and flair, with the exception of the outstanding soundtrack. It's an interesting diversion, but ultimately flawed, and ironically completely outdone by Ferrari F355 Challenge in terms of melding arcade flair and simulation driving in that very same year. When I first played Sega GT, I was initially disappointed with what felt like was a sterile, middling experience. With time, there's an enjoyable game here, with a lot of depth. But sadly, it would struggle for a podium finish in its release year, let alone in the modern day.
The arrival of Gran Turismo in 1998 redefined what gamers would expect from a racing game, pairing quick arcade action with a deeper simulation-based game that let players tweak every inch of their vehicles from their clutch to their camber. So it's no surprise that Sega, undisputed kings of the arcade racer, would try their hand at the Gran Turismo model. The outcome was 2000's SEGA GT on the Dreamcast, and the results are mixed. Visually, it's not one of the Dreamcast's best. Sure, the cars are chunky and detailed, but some of the tracks leave a lot to be desired. Honestly, some of the buildings look like cardboard cutouts. However, all is not lost. The pick of the bunch is Night Section B, clearly inspired by Gran Turismo's special stage Route 11, but that's about as memorable as it gets. Even the on-screen information, position, fastest lap, total time, etc. are shown in a near identical layout and font to that used in Gran Turismo. Sound is adequate and standard fare for a racing game. Engines roar, tyres screech, and metal collides. The music for a Sega racing title is rather tame, with only Night Ground standing out from a somewhat bland offering. Suffice to say, Conditioned Reflex has nothing to worry about here. Sega GT, in a way, sums up the Dreamcast era perfectly. I've always said that with Dreamcast, despite its innovations, Sega tried to be less Sega and more PlayStation. The design of the system, the marketing, the insistence that Dreamcast not be stigmatised with arcade ports like the Saturn were at odds with Sega's heritage and creative legacy. And this same internal struggle burns within Sega GT. It tries to be a deep, option-laden simulation racer, but it can't escape its creator's past, yearning to be an arcade racer and ultimately struggling to be competent at either. The Championship mode introduces itself like a Gran Turismo Lite of sorts. As with Peliphary's title, you have to earn licenses of various classes in order to compete, but on a more linear scale. You simply need to complete a lap within the allotted time, and the licence is yours. You also have car dealers with brands like Audi, Honda, Dodge and Mitsubishi to choose from, and a tuning garage to tweak your ride to perfection. Gameplay wise, sadly, the handling leaves a lot to be desired, feeling oddly twitchy in third person and even worse in first person, where it legitimately feels like your car is balancing on a single wheel in the centre of the screen. It's like you're driving Del Boy's Reliant Robin. Thankfully, the game does allow you to tweak the handling via the garage, but you have to own a car first to use it. And the license challenges use preset cars that aren't customisable, so it gives a pretty poor first impression. The single race mode is exactly as it sounds. You choose from easy, normal and hard class and have immediate access to all the cars to take round a track of your choosing, but unfortunately they're all stock settings, which takes us back to the handling point. None of the cars feel different or unique. Sega GT sadly hasn't aged well. I imported the Japanese version back in the day and remember enjoying it for the most part, but nostalgia is not sugarcoating this one unfortunately. For me, Sega GT suffers most because it's Sega trying to imitate rather than innovate.